Did you know that the man who executed the very King of France was born into a family where killing was the family business? Charles-Henri Sanson not only severed the head of Louis XVI, but was responsible for the deaths of nearly 3,000 people in Paris over the course of 40 years. But this isn't the story of just any killer. It's the story of the most famous executioner in history. A man who lived through the bloodiest moments of France and ended up more famous than many of the nobles he executed. Imagine for a moment that your last name was synonymous with death. That every time someone heard your name, they immediately thought of blood, screams, and rolling heads. That was the reality of the Sanson family. It wasn't just Charles Henry who had this job. It was his entire family. His great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and himself. A dynasty of executioners that lasted over 150 years. Charles Henry was born on February 15, 1739. In Paris, when France was ruled by all-powerful kings and the guillotine didn't even exist. His father was the official executioner of the kingdom. A job no one wanted, but someone had to do. From a young age, Charles Henry knew what his destiny would be. There was no choice. At the time, trades were inherited from father to son, and he had been born into the wrong family or the right one, depending on how you see it. But here's the interesting part. Charles Henry didn't want to be an executioner. His dream was to become a soldier, to fight in epic battles, to defend France with honor. However, fate had other plans. When his father grew old, he had no choice but to take up the red cloak of Paris's official executioner. It was 1778, and at 39 years old, he became the most feared man in the city. To understand what it meant to be an executioner in those days, you have to picture a very different France. There were no quick and humane executions. The condemned died in horrific ways, hanged, burned alive, torn apart. It was a public spectacle where families brought their children to watch criminals die. Charles Henry had to do all of this with his own hands. The job wasn't just brutal, it was also extremely dangerous. People hated executioners. They were considered cursed, untouchable. Charles Henry and his family lived isolated from society. They couldn't attend church with others. They couldn't marry into normal families. And their children were rejected from schools. It was as if they bore an invisible mark that separated them from the rest of the world. Then came 1789. With it, the French Revolution. Charles Henry's world changed forever. The French people were tired of poverty, tired of paying taxes, while the nobles lived in luxury. The streets of Paris echoed with cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but they also echoed with screams and spilled blood. The revolutionaries needed to execute a lot of people, and fast. The problem was that traditional methods were too slow and gruesome. Imagine having to chop off heads with a sword, one after another. Charles Henry complained. It was impossible. The sword dulled quickly, and the physical effort was exhausting. They needed something better. That's when the guillotine came in. A doctor named Joseph Ignace Guillotin proposed the machine as a more humane and efficient method of execution. The idea was simple but brilliant. A heavy blade that fell from a great height, severing the head in one swift motion. Quick, painless, impartial. Noble or commoner, everyone died the same. Charles Henry was the first man to use the guillotine. On April 25, 1792, he executed Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, a highway robber. The machine worked perfectly. Pelletier's head rolled, and a new era of execution had begun. The crowd, however, was disappointed. They had come expecting a long, bloody spectacle, and it was over in seconds. They cried out for the return of the gallows, but the guillotine was too efficient to stop, and Charles Henry became the master of this deadly machine. During the bloodiest years of the Revolution, known as the Reign of Terror, the guillotine worked non-stop. Every day there were executions. The Place de la Revolution became a river of blood. On January 21st, 1793, came the moment that would change France forever. Charles-Henri received the most important order of his career, to execute King Louis XVI. The very king who had been the symbol of absolute power was now simply citizen Louis Capet, waiting for his turn at the guillotine. That morning, 80,000 people gathered to watch the king die. Charles-Henri had executed hundreds of criminals, but this was different. This man had been anointed by God, had ruled France, had lived in the most luxurious palace in the world. And now he stood there, hands bound, waiting for the blade to fall. Louis XVI climbed the scaffold with dignity. He looked at Charles-Henri and asked why the drums had stopped. He wanted to say a few final words, to proclaim his innocence, but the drums resumed, drowning out his voice. The blade fell. The King of France's head rolled on the ground. France would never be the same. Charles-Henri lifted the severed head to show it to the crowd. 80,000 voices cried out, "Long live the Republic!" The French monarchy had died on that guillotine, and he had been the instrument of that death. But the royal blood didn't stop there. 9 months later, on October 16, 1793, came the moment many French citizens had awaited, the execution of Marie Antoinette. The most hated queen in France, accused of treason and conspiracy against the nation's freedom, was now just the widow Capet, awaiting her fate. Unlike her husband, Marie Antoinette arrived at the scaffold in very different condition. She had spent months in prison, had lost weight, and her hair had turned white from stress. She was no longer the glamorous queen of Versailles, who spent fortunes on dresses and parties. She was a 37-year-old woman, broken by the loss of her husband and separation from her children. That morning, Charles-Henri awaited her at the Place de la Revolution. The crowd was even larger than the day the king was executed. Everyone wanted to see the Austrian, as they derisively called her, die. For many, she symbolized everything they hated about the old regime: excessive luxury, indifference toward the people, betrayal of France. Marie Antoinette climbed into the cart that would take her to her death, her hands tied behind her back. During the 45-minute journey from prison to the guillotine, the crowd hurled insults, threw stones, cursed her. She kept her composure, looking straight ahead, preparing for the end. When she reached the scaffold, Charles-Henri followed the usual protocol. He cut her hair so it wouldn't interfere with the blade, checked that her hands were properly tied. Nervous and frightened, Marie Antoinette walked toward the steps of the guillotine. In that moment of extreme tension, she accidentally stepped on Charles-Henri's foot. Her final words were an automatic, polite apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even in death, aristocratic manners prevailed. Charles-Henri would remember those words for years. The queen knelt, placed her head in the lunette of the guillotine. Charles-Henri ensured everything was in place. The crowd screamed for blood. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. Marie Antoinette's head rolled across the platform. Charles-Henri lifted it to show the frenzied crowd. With that execution, Charles-Henri had killed France's last two monarchs. Louis XVI on January 21st, Marie Antoinette on October 16th. In less than a year, he had decapitated the entire French monarchy. It was a historic moment. For the first time in over 1,000 years, France had no kings. During those terrible years, Charles-Henri executed all sorts of people: nobles who had lived in palaces, priests who refused to swear loyalty to the revolution, revolutionaries who had fallen out of favor. He executed Charlotte Corday, the woman who murdered Marat in his bathtub. He executed Danton, one of the revolution's most charismatic leaders. He even executed Robespierre, the architect of the terror. The irony was cruel. Charles-Henri, the executioner, watched the same men who had ordered the killings pass through his guillotine. The revolution was devouring its own children, and he was the one holding the knife and fork. But Charles-Henri wasn't just a head-chopping robot. He was a man with feelings, doubts, fears. He wrote letters describing how he felt. In one of them, he recounted how Louis XVI had spoken to him before dying, how the king tried to maintain his dignity until the end. It wasn't easy to kill. A king, even for someone whose job was to kill. The job was also technically demanding. Charles-Henri had to keep the guillotine in perfect condition. The blade had to be sharp, the mechanisms greased, the ropes taut. A failure could mean a botched execution, which was unacceptable. He developed a flawless routine: inspect every part, test the mechanism, clean the blood from previous executions. He also had to manage the crowd. Public executions were social events. Families came with picnic baskets, street vendors sold food and drinks. Children played near the scaffold. It was a macabre party, and he was the main performer. Some days he executed one person, some days 20. During the peak of the terror, the guillotine worked like a factory line. The condemned arrived in carts, waited their turn, climbed the scaffold, died, and the next would follow. Charles-Henri developed deadly efficiency. He could complete an execution in under 3 minutes, but everything comes at a price. The psychological toll of killing nearly 3,000 people couldn't be ignored. Charles-Henri began facing financial problems. He spent too much, perhaps to forget what he did every day. He even pawned his own guillotine, which was scandalous for an official executioner. His family suffered too. His children grew up knowing their father was the most hated man in Paris. They couldn't make friends easily, couldn't go out in public without being pointed at. The Sanson name was a curse passed down through generations. When the terror finally ended, Charles-Henri continued working, though executions became less frequent. Napoleon rose to power, and France began to stabilize. Nobles were no longer executed just for being nobles, nor priests for being priests. Executions returned to being for common criminals. Charles-Henri aged in his post. His hands, which had held thousands of severed heads, began to tremble. His eyes, which had seen so much blood, started to fail. But he kept working until 1795, when he finally retired and passed the job to his son. His retirement was not peaceful. People don't easily forget the man who executed their king. Charles-Henri lived with the stain of what he had done. He couldn't walk through Paris without being recognized, pointed at, cursed. He was famous, but it was the worst kind of fame. He died on July 4th, 1806, at 67 years old. He had lived long enough to see France shift from monarchy to revolution, from terror to stability, from republic to Napoleon's empire. He had been witness and participant in one of the bloodiest periods in European history. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was just a man doing his job, a job someone had to do. Society needed executioners, and he was good at it. On the other, he had executed a king, severed thousands of heads, been the instrument of the terror. History remembers him as the most famous executioner in the world. His name appears in history books, novels, and films. The guillotine he operated became the symbol of the French Revolution. But behind that symbol was a real man, with real doubts, real pain. Charles-Henri Sanson didn't choose to be an executioner, but he became the best of his time. In an era when death was a public show, he was the star. In a time when revolution changed everything, he was the constant. Always there, always ready, always efficient. His story reminds us that behind every great historical event are ordinary people doing extraordinary jobs. Charles-Henri was not a monster. He was a man trapped in extraordinary circumstances, doing what he had to do to survive in a world gone mad. The next time you hear about the French Revolution, about the guillotine, about the death of Louis XVI, remember Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who inherited a terrible job, did it for 40 years, and became an indelible part of French history. The executioner of Paris, who killed a king and changed the world forever.